In 2015, a geneticist at Harvard University named Pontus Skoglund was running routine analysis on ancient DNA samples when something on his screen made him stop cold. He called David Reich, one of the most respected names in paleogenetics, into the room. Neither of them spoke for a full minute. The genetic sequence they were looking at contained a signal that, according to every textbook ever written about human migration, should not exist.
So the mixing started and then it froze. And the freezing happened 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, and it froze because of cultural change.
It matched populations from Aboriginal Australia and the islands of Melanesia, but the bones it came from were buried in the Amazon rainforest, thousands of miles and an entire ocean away from where that DNA was supposed to be. The team ran the test again. Same result. They tested different samples. Same result. What they were looking at was about to detonate everything we thought we knew about who reached the Americas first and how the ancestors of the Aztecs actually got there. This is not a theory anymore. This is data pulled from the bones of the dead, and it is rewriting human history in real time. For decades, the story was simple. Small groups of hunters crossed a frozen land bridge from Siberia into Alaska roughly 15,000 years ago, then slowly wandered south over millennia. No boats, no ocean crossings, just one long walk from Asia. Within this neat little model, the ancestors of every indigenous American, from the Inuit of the Arctic to the Aztecs of Mexico, came from the same Siberian stock. But here's the catch. When Skoglund and Reich published their findings in the journal Nature, they revealed a genetic ghost hiding in the data. They called it Population Y, and it proved that at least one ancient group reached the Americas by a route that no historian had ever seriously considered. The closest genetic match was not Siberia or East Asia. It was Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians from islands near Papua New Guinea. Let that sink in for a second. People carrying DNA from the other side of the planet somehow made it to South America over 15,000 years ago. And their genetic fingerprint survived in isolated groups like the Surui and Caritiana peoples of the Brazilian Amazon, where researchers found the signal strongest. At first, the scientific community pushed back hard. Contamination, they said. Lab error. But Reich's team had anticipated the skepticism. They ran control after control. They tested the famous Anzac 1 skeleton, a child buried in Montana over 12,000 years ago, and found no trace of the signal there. That meant whatever group carried this Australasian DNA took a different path, one that bypassed North America entirely, or arrived so early that later migrations buried their traces everywhere except the most remote corners of the continent. And get this, the signal did not spread evenly. It survived in pockets of the Amazon, but vanished almost completely from Mesoamerica, the very region where the Aztecs would later build their empire. That uneven distribution tells a dark story. Entire populations carrying this ancient DNA were wiped out or absorbed by later waves of migrants over thousands of years. The Aztecs did not build their civilization on empty land. They inherited a continent already soaked in forgotten blood. But the Australasian signal was just the beginning. What researchers found when they turned their attention to the Aztec heartland itself. That is where the real mystery starts. The Valley of Mexico was a crossroads of human movement for millennia before the Aztecs ever arrived. Recent mitochondrial DNA analysis, the genetic material passed exclusively through mothers, shows that this region served as a dispersal hub for populations across the entire hemisphere. Genetic lines originating here appear in groups as far south as Patagonia. The people and ideas of ancient Mexico were shaping the world thousands of miles from home, long before the Aztec Empire existed. When the Aztecs showed up in 1325 and founded Tenochtitlan on a swampy island, they stepped into a region already layered with the biological echoes of vanished civilizations. The Olmec, the Maya, the builders of the Great Pyramids at Teotihuacan, all of them left genetic traces in the local population. It is not that simple, though. When geneticists examined the Y chromosomes, the DNA passed from father to son, they discovered something disturbing. The male lineages of the civilizations that preceded the Aztecs had almost completely disappeared. The maternal line survived and continued forward, but the fathers, the men who built those earlier empires, gone, almost totally erased from the genetic record. This points to something historians had long suspected but never confirmed. The transitions of power in ancient Mesoamerica were not peaceful. They were not gradual. They were biological purges. When a new group seized control, they did not just replace the government, they replaced the men. But here is the deal. The most shocking example of this came from the ruins of Teotihuacan, the massive abandoned city that still dominates the Mexican landscape. For years, archaeologists wondered what caused its sudden collapse around 50 AD. The temples were burned, the elite quarters were destroyed, the population scattered. Now we know what happened to the ruling class. In 2017, a team of researchers analyzed DNA extracted from burials at Teotihuacan and surrounding sites. What they found reads like a crime scene report. The Y chromosome lineages present in the city's earlier periods, the genetic signatures of the men who built and governed that civilization, were almost completely absent from later burials. The replacement was not gradual. It happened within a generation or two. When Dr. Jaime Maramiguez at the University of Texas examined the data, the implications were clear. This was not a slow decline. This was an extermination of the male ruling class, followed by a rapid takeover by outside groups, carrying different paternal DNA. The women remained. They carried the culture forward, passed down their mitochondrial DNA to future generations. But the men of the old order were systematically removed from the gene pool. This is where things get wild. The Aztecs themselves had no idea who built Teotihuacan. By the time they arrived in the valley 800 years later, the city was already an ancient ruin. They named it the place where the gods were born because they could not imagine that mere humans had constructed something so vast. They looked at those pyramids with the same awe we feel today. And now we understand why. The people who actually built Teotihuacan, at least the men who led that society, had been erased so thoroughly that even their memory was lost. The Aztecs were walking through a graveyard of a civilization whose male founders no longer existed in any form, not in the oral histories, not in the genealogies, not in the blood of the descendants. The genetic data served as a silent witness to a massacre that history forgot. But the vanishing fathers of Teotihuacan were not unique. This pattern repeated across Mesoamerican history. Every major collapse, every transition of power left the same signature in the DNA. The maternal lines continued. The paternal lines were severed. The Aztecs were simply the last and most successful group to play this brutal game. When the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico, they found a fractured landscape still recovering from centuries of upheaval. And they had one massive advantage. Their own paternal lineages were intact. Their male ancestry was strong, unified, unbroken. Within 200 years, they transformed from wandering outsiders into the rulers of an empire spanning millions of people. They merged their Y chromosome lineages with the surviving local populations and quickly dominated the genetic as well as political landscape of central Mexico. And get this, DNA evidence suggests this was not accidental. The Aztecs were not just building temples. They were rebuilding the human population of Mexico around their own bloodlines. Their rapid rise makes perfect sense when you stop seeing them as lucky nomads and start seeing them as inheritors of a proven playbook. They were using strategies perfected over thousands of years by every dominant group before them. From their complex legal codes that governed millions of subjects to their advanced Chinampas farming systems that turned swamps into productive land, the Aztecs operated like engineers working from inherited blueprints, and the DNA confirms it. They were not a single ethnic group, but the product of centuries of biological and cultural merging, a synthesis of survivors from every wave of migration and conquest that had swept through the region. Their language, Nahuatl, became the universal tongue of trade across a vast territory stretching from the edges of what is now the United States deep into Central America. Merchants spoke it in markets hundreds of miles from Tenochtitlan, and genetic analysis proves those trade routes were also highways for ancestry. Families moved along those paths, spreading their DNA alongside their goods. The Aztecs mastered this network. They absorbed every culture they encountered into a unified system of commerce, tribute, and blood. Here's the catch. That mysterious Australasian signal, population Y, had almost completely disappeared from this region by the time the Aztecs rose to power. Whatever ancient group carried it into the Americas had been overwritten by later migrations, their genetic contribution buried under layers of subsequent arrivals. But in the deepest Amazon, where isolation protected small groups from the waves of change sweeping the rest of the continent, the signals survived. This tells us something profound about the history of the Americas. The land the Aztecs inherited was not a blank slate. It was a palimpsest, a manuscript written over, and over by different hands across thousands of years. The Aztecs were just the latest authors, writing their chapter on top of stories that had been mostly erased. The presence of Population Y and the systematic disappearance of ancient male lineages prove that the history of the Americas is a global story, far more complex than any textbook admits. The New World was never isolated. It was a destination for migrants and explorers who crossed oceans and ice bridges, carrying the biological fingerprints of distant lands. And the Aztecs? They were the most brilliant expression of that global convergence. Despite the devastation of European diseases, the brutality of the conquest, and the deliberate destruction of their records, the genetic blueprint survived. Spanish soldiers burned the libraries of Tenochtitlan, priests smashed the idols and banned the old religions. But the fundamental truth stayed hidden where no fire could reach it. In the cells of the survivors, in the DNA passed, from parent to child, across 20 generations. Today, that genetic archive is finally being read. Researchers like David Reich at Harvard and teams across Mexico and South America are piecing together a picture of human migration that makes the old Bering Strait model look laughably incomplete. The Aztecs were not an isolated phenomenon. They were the peak of a civilization built on thousands of years of human movement, mixture, and replacement. Their blood still flows in millions of people across the globe. The descendants of the sun worshippers are not artifacts in a museum. They are alive, carrying within them the genetic record of everything that came before. The bones have finally spoken. Population Y proves that ancient travelers reached the Americas from directions we never imagined. The vanishing Y chromosomes of Teotihuacan prove that the rise and fall of civilizations was written in blood as much as stone. And the genetic mosaic of the Aztec Empire proves that the people who built Tenochtitlan were inheritors of a legacy stretching back to the dawn of human migration itself. If the ancestors of the Aztecs carried DNA from Australia, who else made it to the Americas before history began recording? And what happened to them? The technology to answer those questions exists. The bones are waiting in the ground, and every new sample tested adds another piece to a puzzle that keeps getting bigger and stranger. The secrets encoded in ancient DNA are just beginning to surface, and they are asking us to throw out the maps we thought we understood. What do you think is the next impossible discovery waiting in the genetic record? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe for more investigations into history's buried secrets.